And it's hard to get good data to really break it down, but it really is an important issue that we're trying to look at.
I mean, Sabir also had a two-hander and Tom to Ernie.
Sort of very quickly, because
I only have one hand.
Yeah.
I think just on the exchange rate issue again, it is true that Korea and China are not really competing in the same export markets, and they're big provider of capital and intermediate goods. So the exchange rate appreciation doesn't really, I mean, not lack of appreciation doesn't bother them that much. It's a bit like Japan and China as well, for the same reasons that, you know, Korea is further up the value chain, if you like, and providing convenience. The problem, though, is that there are many people betting on Chinese appreciation, and for them, and I've been puzzled by this for about 12 years since the Asian crisis, that people use Korea often as a proxy currency because it's a deep and liquid market. So if you want to take a position in the renminbi, you just park your money in Korea, assuming that when China appreciates, Korea will allow more appreciation, so you make money. So it's a proxy play. And so that makes capital inflows into Korea worse. And that's, I think, the more bothersome issue, rather than just the trade effect.
Yeah.
Joe, you had a two-hander.
This is just about sudden stops. Just an anecdote. In the Asian crisis, Australia experienced a sudden stop. Before the crisis, during the crisis, their capital inflows fell from a 5% of GDP inflow to a 1% of GDP outflow. So it's a pretty big sudden stop. Well, the Australian dollar crashed. The Reserve Bank of Australia did a little bit of intervention, but not much. Basically, a little crash happened. What happened to the Australian economy? It boomed. I think we need to think harder about whether sudden stops are harmful or not, and what makes them harmful. And that's why I think about currency mismatches. Because Australia did not have a currency mismatch. Never have that. And I think that's the kind of evidence that comes.
Yeah, I think that's right. This is just, despite the number of articles that have been done on this, there's a huge amount more to do. Like, I always, in my mind, sort of thought of sudden stops in currency crises as sort of roughly the same thing. If you look at the statistical studies, there's only about a 50% correlation. And so another thing that we're trying to get a better handle on is, are these really different phenomena, or is it just you're measuring the same thing and they're, because you also, different measures of currency crises don't fully match up, nor different measures of sudden stops. So I've got several former graduate students who have asked to sort of really be trying to investigate and do a nice survey paper for us on the differences on these.
Yeah, well, this is a good transition. If I might just step back and make a couple of comments leading up to the question of Korea. My own judgment these days, trying to track all this, is a great disarray and confusion in what is the international financial system, and particularly that applies to discussions within the IMF. And in my own judgment, first you have to have a fairly clear picture of what exchange rate policy should be. And then other things such as appropriate reserves, rules of intervention, and derivative. For example, if you have a freely floating rate, which is the dollar, the euro, and a number of other major currencies freely floating, your reserves are minimal or none, and you don't need rules, which you don't intervene much. And I think so that's where you have to start, have a clearer picture of what is going to be the exchange rate system. My own judgment, saying this for some years, it should be a two-cornered system. And for those of you who are students of plane geometry and say, got that 3/4 for a triangle. Some of we former naval people that study spherical trigonometry. In a globalized world, many of the figures have 2 corners. The first corner, of course, would be market-oriented, lightly managed or floating rates. The second corner is currency union, based on absolute currency area, pluses and minuses. And that's the way we should be going. And in fact, my own judgment is that for the major Asian economy, currency union is not the way. The dynamic economy is monetary only for obvious reasons. So from that basis, one observation is that it seems to me that this time, a much bigger crisis than in the late 90s, there was a great deal of, much more movement toward lightly managed floating rates, as was just mentioned. And that has enabled, even though the crisis is a lot worse than the late 90s, there's been a quicker and better adjustment because in domestic economies, because they let the exchange rate do more of the adjusting, and they could then focus their other policies on the domestic side. So I think sometimes you have to have a crisis to do some of the right things, and some of the reforms in South Korea in the late 90s were because they had a crisis. Maybe this time we'll learn we should have used the exchange rate more and get close to market rates. China, of course, a big exception for making the decision there. So my question is this in fact true that there's been quite a substantial change because of the crisis in what is the international exchange rate system, movement by most, except China, toward lighter managed floating rates, and Korea might be an outstanding example of that, having let the rate go way down, now it's coming back up. But as you said before, even though that sounds terrible when your rate swings and there's a cost, that enables you to do other things that get you through it. So I'm sort of getting a little more optimistic that maybe a good crisis now and then pushes the system in a sensible direction, gets away from all this confused discussion about reserve levels, rules for intervention, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Before you move on, let's have Larry Thomas.
You commented earlier about the macro policy has to pay more attention to the financial factors. Yet, we're pretty much still talking at the macro level here. And what has impressed me in this discussion, especially Super Law's comments, is we need to know a lot more about the specific exposures in the various sectors of the economy, stocks versus flows, and those that you really want to have a good analytical basis for policy. And gross versus net is not sufficient. What are the exposures of the corporates, which I haven't heard a lot about? What are the banks? Banks are regulating corporates not. What are the household businesses? What are the foreign versus domestic banks? And unless you have the data to elaborate on those things and think about how various sectors are going to be affected by exchange rate policies, by other exchange rate changes in policies, you really can't answer a lot of these questions. You can't really say as macro policy ought to be, what regulatory policy ought to be. And I think that was the conclusion of the study that was done by the Financial Stability Forum, kind of Financial Stability Forum, immediately after the Asian crisis. They did a paper on volatile capital flows. The answer is you can't control, but you need to look at it. You need to know a lot more about the risk exposures associated with these that you need to generate a lot of data. I'm not sure those data have been collected with the reporting systems that have responded to the need for this kind of information.
Yes. No, just like Korea. So there's a comment, there's a couple of observations rather than a question. One observation that came up over there as well, that seems to happen a lot, is every time there's a crisis, there always is fix the facts. I don't know what the argument here is in the Asian case. To make an observation on that, in my own work, as much as I have it on this sort of thing, it would appear that there's probably two groups in Asia, Korea and Japan and perhaps the US as well, and China and some satellites and some others. And so an observation there is very important. I think the asymmetry of particular capital links, it came out already between trade is one thing, but capital links is another, and the asymmetry between the two is very important. So that presumably imposes a lot of costs. I like the idea because it gives me of great coordination, being very important. And going back into ancient literature, get mine. Fixing exchange rates, or at least targeting exchange rates, is a very important instrument for coordination because the distribution effects are enormous. Again, so the asymmetries are removed. So I would be concerned to make sure that came out in the argument strongly.
Yeah. Well,